Kia ora koutou. Welcome everyone to our webinar. I'm Tessa Zant, Manager of Engagement at Christchurch City Council. This is our third webinar in the series on the district plan changes, so thank you to those of us who have joined us for all of these sessions, and welcome to anyone joining us for the first time. Today we're going to provide you with a bit more detail around the proposed zone provisions and the new proposed qualifying matters for District Plan Change 14. Next slide. Your mics and cameras are switched off so that we can keep the session moving along. We've got a lot of information to get through tonight. Thank you to those who have already sent in your questions. You can also ask questions throughout the session using the chat button, which is located at the top bar of your menu. If you're unable to use chat for any reason, please email questions to engagement@ccc.govt.nz on your screen now. Apologies if we don't get through all of the questions during the session. I anticipate that we won't. It is a long session and we have had a lot of questions, and we might need to do a little bit more research to answer your question well. We will upload a complete Q&A document to our website and email a link directly to the email address that you used to sign up for the event this evening. And this is likely to be early next week to give us time to get through all of those questions. If you are hard of hearing or if for any reason you experience sound issues throughout the session, see the black image to the right of your screen now. You can turn on the live captions by clicking on the three small dots at the top of your screen above the More button. Click Turn on Live Captions near the bottom of the drop-down list that will appear. Please note that the session is being recorded and will also be uploaded to our website along with the Q&A early next week. Slide. So I'm now going to hand over to our technical team for the evening, Mark Stevenson and David Hatton.
Thank you, Tessa, and welcome to tonight's webinar. The purpose of this evening's webinar is to provide you with an update on the plan change from the last webinar presented in December. In doing so, I'll explain the proposed qualifying matters, which will form part of the plan change recommended for Council's approval on the 1st of March. I'll also outline some of the provisions that have been amended since September. I'll briefly touch on some changes to zoning and then am happy to answer questions. Next slide, please. Just before we take a deep dive into the qualifying matters and the provisions, just a reminder of the context that we're planning in, that the government's direction in the National Policy Statement on Urban Development and the subsequent legislation to enable housing supply anticipates that there's a greater emphasis on growing up rather than out. That direction for a more consolidated or compact urban form aligns with direction that's coming through in the Greater Christchurch Urban Growth Programme, as well as the City Council's own planning for the Otatahi Christchurch Plan, and more will come out on that in the near future. The government has also released direction more recently on the protection of highly productive land for rural activity, and so that restricts the outward growth of the city. Through the plan change, growing up is achieved in a number of ways, but greatest height is enabled within the city centre, with graduated heights ranging from our largest through to our smallest centres, and that extends to the surrounds of those centres, acknowledging that the highly accessible locations and intensification around them can promote good urban form outcomes. And I'll come on to talk about the qualifying matters which focus development along public transport routes, which aligns with the Urban Growth Programme. Next slide, please. So this evening I will talk through a number of qualifying matters which were referred to in December. Some of those at that time work was still underway, and tonight's presentation I can share with you what is proposed by council. That covers the qualifying matters listed on the slide, as well as changes to provisions and zoning and overlay changes that I alluded to earlier. I'm now going to hand over to Dave Hatton, who will speak to you about the first of those new qualifying matters on sunlight access.
Thanks, Mark. I'm going to talk briefly about the qualifying matter for sunlight access, and this introduces a tighter recession plane for Christchurch than in other local authority areas. This matter was a great concern to our community, and we think there's a sound basis for introducing it. Christchurch has more sun hours than other cities, but lower temperatures. It also has lower sunlight angles. This means that buildings will cast more shadow on the site next door to them. And it also means that there's more, because the sun hits the windows at a straighter angle, that it's more effective at heating the interior of houses. So solar heating is particularly effective in Christchurch. The generous MDRS recession planes create a generous building envelope, and what this means is that there is scope to tighten that up a little bit without really affecting how many units can be built. We also think that sunlight access is well understood by the community, and it's valued by house purchasers. So it's something that good sunlight access might feed through into increased values and increased feasibility. Have the next slide. So this diagram illustrates how sun angles might influence the shading of houses on the site next door. It looks at a particular planned development, so we're looking at the planned character, the future character of these areas, and potential for shading. And this example is actually from Auckland, and what we're going to be looking at is the difference between Auckland, Hamilton, and Tauranga, those upper North Island cities where most of the MDRS is, and Christchurch, which is 7 degrees of latitude further south, and the different impact between sun angles have here compared to those other cities. And what we find is that the North Island cities get, not surprisingly, more sun. They get more months of sun, and they get more sun each day. But what we're particularly showing here is that if you take a site that's oriented east to west, and with its outdoor living space at the north, what you'd find building MDRS style development is that in Auckland, you would expect that there would be a limit to how much sun you'd get on that row of houses to the south. They probably wouldn't get sun in the ground floor for over 3 months of the year. Can I have the next slide, please? The difference in Christchurch, looking at the same sun angles at the same time of year, is that you would expect that there would be sun on the ground floor, but you'd actually have 5 months or more where the sun wouldn't reach it because it would be obscured by the house next door. So there's quite significant difference in the sun access in the same development built in different cities, and it varies according to orientation. But what we found quite consistently is that in this Christchurch, we get about 20 to 25% less sunlight hours in winter than Auckland, based on the recession planes that we've been given. Have the next slide, please. And so the response to that is, in order to make that Christchurch shading envelope similar to Auckland, is a change of the recession plane. And actually what we found is we don't need to change it drastically. If we drop the height that it operates from 4 meters to 3 and apply a plane of between 50 and 60 degrees, then we end up with a similar outcome to Auckland. And that's what our proposal is. Have the next slide, please. It's a concern to us that they, in doing so, that we don't change the viability of development sites to the extent that you can't achieve 3 stories on a typical site. So we've done some modelling of how you might develop our typical Christchurch sites, which are usually around 15 metres wide. And what we find there is, on a MDRS style development, by the time you've put in all the things that you have to have on the site, like the outdoor living space, the access, servicing, you would usually get about 7 3-storey units on that site. And looking at a development using our revised recession planes, we find that probably still get 7 units on, but the effect it would be that maybe one of those units would have to be reduced to 2 stories. So there is an impact, but it's quite a small one. Now the next. We've then looked at what happens in the high density zone where we the legislation requires us to allow for 6 stories. What we found there is in order to do so, recession planes are actually not the most effective way to guarantee sun into the sites next door. And the reason for that is that the sun angles are so low that the recession plane would have to be so shallow that it's not practical to implement what the government's trying to achieve, 6 stories, and also allow for sunlight access through a recession plane. And a better way to deal with it is actually to make sure that you get sun in between the gaps in the buildings, because most of the sun you receive is oblique angles anyway. And so the approach we've taken is to make sure that the upper floors are set well back, that the buildings are not too large, and that there's separation between them. And that creates a situation where sun comes between the gaps in the buildings. And that's what I have to say. So back to Mark.
Thank you, Dave. I'm now going to talk about the other qualifying matters that Council is proposing, starting with a qualifying matter that relates to public transport accessibility. The image on the right there shows a large red blob, which represents areas where intensification would be focused. The circles represent the different centres that we have in the city. So the largest red circle is the central city, and then the yellow represent our 3 largest centres, being Hornby, Riccarton, and Papanui. The green circles represent our second tier centres of Linwood, Shirley, and North Horswell, based on their size, and then the purple other large centres, namely Maryvale, Sydenham, and Belfast. The approach is to limit or restrict intensification in areas that are not within a walkable distance of core bus routes, and that's to facilitate the greatest intensification along those routes, which aligns with an investment strategy for public transport. By having a larger population close to bus stops, it increases the efficiency of investment in bus transport. There's a higher propensity to use public transport if people are within a walkable distance, and that provides accessibility to a range of services and employment. In doing so, it can reduce reliance on private vehicle usage and better achieve the outcomes of the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. Next slide, please. So taking it to another level of detail, the purple areas on this map represent areas that would be excluded from the medium density residential zone and where a suburban density would apply. The orange area on the map represents those areas within 800 metres of defined bus routes, and I'll explain those shortly. And the red on the same map represents the airport noise contour line, the airport noise contour within which development is restricted to a suburban density as well. The areas that have been defined in orange represents 800 metres walking distance from 5 core bus routes, which have been defined through a public transport futures business case process. In addition to that, we've identified other routes, namely the number 17 route in Maryvale and Brynwa, the number 29 route from Fendleton to the airport, the number 44 route from the city to Shirley, and the number 125 route between Redwood and Horswell. All these routes have been selected on the basis they provide connections between employment centres or between centres and other employment areas with reference to the airport, but also large areas of employment in the northwest around Burnside. The orange area on the map also represents existing areas that are zoned for intensification being zoned residential medium density and residential suburban density transition. And that's been translated into a medium density residential zone. So in effect, by applying this qualifying matter, those areas in purple are excluded. Within the orange, I should add, is also the high density residential zone, and that remains unchanged from the earlier proposal. That recognises that the high density zone is in those areas most accessible and in and around our city centre and suburban centres. Next slide, please. Another qualifying matter that we're proposing to restrict the intensification in relation to is on our two key transport corridors to the north and to the southwest. The image on the left identifies what is being investigated by way of a business case for mass rapid transit. These two corridors, we anticipate having significant investment in the future, and that will be in both transport, but also in terms of improvements to the spaces within those corridors. We want to ensure that development now doesn't compromise the outcomes sought for what is described as the city spine. And to achieve that, we're proposing that development is set back further than it would otherwise be under the medium density residential standards. So rather than a 1.5 metre setback from the road boundary, a setback of 3 to 4 metres would apply. And that safeguards that land for future opportunities in terms of the corridor. For instance, it could be used for tree planting and other improvements to make the space amenable to activities and also for a range of modes of transport. The land in question that is identified by way of the setback may not be designated. A designation to widen the road reserve will be investigated, but it will be pursued separately at a future date. Next slide, please. A further qualifying matter that we are proposing is the tsunami, an area affected by tsunami inundation. We've, since the proposal in September, we've obtained updated data from NIWA, and that data is represented on the map by the area in blue, which is an area that could be affected in a 1 in 500 year event. The data reflects a 100 year horizon with over 1 metre of sea level rise, and that is consistent with national direction. Within the tsunami qualifying matter area, intensification would be restricted, and a policy framework would not enable the development of three houses per site up to 3 stories. In addition, we have been looking at a qualifying. In addition, we've been looking at a qualifying matter which applies to sites that are not themselves affected by a hazard, but where the access to those sites is inundated or subject to a hazard as listed on the slide. There has been modelling undertaken, but we're continuing work on that ahead of a report to Council. Next slide, please. The next qualifying matter I want to briefly describe relates to the interface between residential and industrial zones. There's recognition that residential zones that adjoin industrial zones are generally enabled to up to 2 stories or 8 metres, reflecting the suburban context. With intensification under medium density residential standards enabled to 3 stories, there is a risk of increased exposure on that 3rd story to noise from existing industrial activities. So with that risk of increased exposure, we are proposing that any development of 3 stories or more is set back at 120 metres from the edge of an industrial zone unless it can be mitigated. That acknowledges that industrial activities within the industrial zone adjoining may have designed mitigation of their noise for based on the surrounding planning context, which only provides for 2 stories, and the 3rd story could give rise to reverse sensitivity effects or complaints about the industrial activity. It could also expose residents to inappropriate levels of noise. So it's very much seeking to manage activity on the intensification within the residential zone, with options to be investigated for the industrial zone as a separate plan change in the future. Next slide, please. The next qualifying matter I'd like to describe is in relation to the Otakaro Avon River corridor. The Council, under the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, is required to enable intensification within a walkable distance of centres. And part of the Otakaro Avon River corridor is within a walkable distance of the city centre zone, being 1.2 kilometre catchment from the edge of that zone, and within which council would have to enable at least 6 stories. Now, what has changed in our proposal since the September version is the introduction of this qualifying matter. It's proposed that the on the map on the left-hand side, the mustard darker yellow colour represents residential zoning. The grey represents the Otakaro Avon River corridor, and the outcomes for that are defined through the regeneration plan prepared for that area. For the most part, the Otakaro Avon River corridor we can exclude as a qualifying matter on the basis that an outcome of that corridor is principally for open space and for it to be publicly accessible, and that falls within one of the categories that we can include as a qualifying matter. There are, however, 3 sites in private ownership and don't fit within that qualifying matter category because they're not publicly accessible, and they're numbered on the slide as 1, 2, and 3. Sites 2 and 3 are also identified in the regeneration plan as subject to features such as stormwater management, walking and cycling connections, and other matters which and development of those sites would compromise the achievement of those outcomes. So again, we can use a qualifying matter to exclude sites 2 and 3, again, as other qualifying matters. In terms of site 1 is, as I have indicated, in private ownership. The land is has been subject to a private plan change request for enabling housing. Whilst within the walkable distance of the city centre zone, we don't consider 6 stories to be appropriate and have sought advice, geotechnical advice, which has informed a position that we're proposing that it's limited to 3 stories on that site. That's consistent with the advice that will be part of the plan change recommended for notification. Next slide, please. That's the summary of the qualifying matters that we're taking forward. Now, in terms of other provisions, I just want to touch on some of the changes we're proposing in the residential chapter. I'll start just with the internal garage setbacks. So at the moment in the current district plan, a garage can be built right to the boundary, and it's proposed that that is now retained rather than introducing a setback. We're also proposing improved clarity on the glazing requirements that are prescribed in the medium density residential standards. The standards require 20% glazing visible from the road, and the requirement is could be interpreted as applying to the whole site, even residential units that are located at the rear of a site. We're proposing it only applies to the first 12 metres of the site from the road, such that the glazing requirement would only apply to that unit closest to the road and not to units behind it. In addition, there's changes to the site coverage provisions in the high density residential zone. So the medium density residential standards prescribe a 50% site coverage limit, and in the high density residential zone, we're proposing a bonus of 10%, but only under some conditions. Firstly, that there's no car parking present. Secondly, that there's planting and retention of trees and shrubs. Thirdly, that the site has a minimum road frontage of 25 metres, and thirdly, and last but not least, that there's a larger communal living area. The next point is that in the high density residential zone, we're also proposing that there's a minimum of 2 stories. That acknowledges that single story dwellings in a location that's highly accessible to commercial centres is inappropriate and doesn't achieve the urban form anticipated. So that will support higher density in the locations with greatest access to services, employment, amenities, and public transport. In the context of the medium and high density areas, we're also introducing a maximum building length, and we're reintroducing minimum unit sizes to the plan. So at the moment, the district plan has minimum sizes for 1-bedroom units, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, and so forth. And that's proposed to be introduced on the basis that it doesn't limit the density of developments. We're improving the residential design principles, which were in the version presented in September. And in respect of the recession plan, where an exemption from the recession plan is being refined. So in the high density residential zone, the first 20 metres of a site is exempt from compliance with the recession plan on the boundaries with the neighbours. That's on the basis that it encourages development to be fronting the site. However, we are proposing that the height of any development within that first 20 metres of a site is limited to 14 metres, and that the number of dwellings required to apply that exemption for is 3 units rather than 2. In terms of the residential controls, we're also adapting controls to better manage fire risk on the Port Hills and across the city. We're doing that by increasing the minimum access width that's required for any vehicle to access a site or rear sites. That access width is to enable a fire appliance to access those sites, which is critical in the event of a fire, as we've experienced. Last but not least, in terms of tree canopy cover, the draft proposal, the version presented in September, has had a 20% canopy cover requirement, and that's retained in the version we'll be taking to council. However, it's proposed that it's also in the rules that apply to the development stage. Previously, it was only the subdivision rules, but we're proposing it also applies to development, particularly in circumstances where development were to precede subdivision. And as was the case before, if trees are retained on the site and address the 20% canopy cover, then that is sufficient. Alternatively, planting can be undertaken to meet that requirement. And if neither of those options are pursued, then the financial contribution is payable. Next slide. Now, we have been progressing with changes to the planning maps and the zoning. The purple areas on these maps represent commercial zoned areas. The darker brown around them represents a high density residential zone, and the paler colour beyond that represents the medium density residential zone. The key message from these maps is that there's areas that are no longer proposed as high density and are proposed to be medium density. They are highlighted in blue, We're also proposing that there are areas added to the high density residential zone, which were previously shown as medium density. These maps are only a snapshot, and there's a lot of work still being undertaken, particularly in terms of the qualifying matters. So we're unable to share maps beyond what is shown on these slides, and the maps will be available alongside the plan change when the agenda for the council meeting is published next Thursday. A key takeaway from these maps is that the high density residential zone has been based on the extent of a walkable catchment from these centres with a graduated approach. The largest town centres have a 600-metre walking catchment, such as Riccarton or Hornby. Larger local centres and other town centres have a 400-metre walking catchment, so that's the likes of Barrington or North Horswell. And then the smaller local centre, the medium-sized local centres have a 200-metre walking catchment. The extent of the high density zone doesn't always fit with the walkable distance of the walkable catchment, and that's adjusted based on the specific local context. If we drew the walkable catchment, it would be it wouldn't follow natural or physical boundaries, and so the zone in some cases extends further, or in other cases is trimmed back to align with blocks and other physical boundaries. It also reflects the availability of public transport and the function of the centres that those areas are close to. For reference, the map on the left is Linwood, and the blue areas represent areas where high density has been reduced, and the image on the right is Papanui. We'll just move on to the next slide, please. In regards to this next slide, the image on the left represents Church Corner, where there's been changes, both additions and areas excluded from the high density residential zone. We'll just move on to the next slide. The image on the left is Hornby, and on the right is North Horswell. And again, there's additions and reductions made, again, for the reasons I've described earlier. We'll move on to the next slide. Now, under the National Policy Statement on Urban Development, councils are required to enable intensification within a walkable distance of commercial areas. That's not limited to residential zones that intensification can occur within, and it extends to also include other zones, and that includes the specific purpose schools and hospitals zone. In particular, the walkable distance from the city centre zone, we're required to enable at least 6 stories unless a qualifying matter applies. So within the walkable distance, we've got a number of sites, and they're listed on the left-hand column, including St George's, Southern Cross. These are also hospitals that are within a walkable catchment of some centres. And all of the hospital zones are proposed to be enabled to 6 stories, with the exception being the parts of the former Christchurch Women's Hospital site, which would be enabled to 10 stories. That acknowledges that the residential zones around those sites are enabled to those heights, and for the hospital zone to have a lesser height would result in an urban form not consistent with its surroundings. In terms of the schools, we've also identified where intensifications are enabled, and that includes schools in the central city. However, I'd make the point that for some of those schools, particularly for an example, St Michael's, there are heritage buildings within those sites, and those heritage items are a qualifying matter in their own right. So that would preclude development of the heights referred to. Go to the next slide. In terms of the commercial and industrial provisions, there's not wide sweeping changes to what has previously been published. However, the Milton Street Industrial Zone, south of Sydenham Park is proposed to be rezoned to mixed use, and that aligns with the high density response in Sydenham and enables both industrial and residential activity. There's also minor changes proposed to the mixed use extents. We're also adjusting the height limits in the central city mixed use zone within the 4 avenues. Parts of it will remain at 10 stories and other areas will go down to 6 stories. And those areas being retained at 10 stories will be, generally speaking, adjoining the business zone or city centre zone as it's to be called. Next slide, please. Now, we've had correspondence and recognised the capacity of the infrastructure network is important to consider and reflects the need for an integrated approach to planning. What I'd emphasise is that we are working closely with our infrastructure teams and helping plan what is required in the way of future network to accommodate the demand. Infrastructure planning is based on expected growth projections, and capacity audits identify where capacity needs to be upgraded to meet that increase in demand. And of course, there'll be a need to revisit that based on changes in the rules, which will consider the degree, but also the distribution of intensification over the planning period. As intensification does occur, there are upgrades that occur reflecting the increased demand, and that is funded either in part or full by developers. Council as infrastructure owner and manager can, of course, also decline or reject connections to the network where that would give rise to adverse effects. So Council does have discretion even beyond this plan change. We have identified, by way of a qualifying matter, 3 areas where intensification is not appropriate based on infrastructure, being Prestons, Aranui and Shirley. However, other areas of the city, there are not the same reasons to justify a qualifying matter, and we will consider those areas for infrastructure planning. Next slide, please. Now, given the recent events in Auckland, but also the wider North Island, we appreciate and acknowledge the flooding and impacts of the cyclone and the impacts that it can have on the urban area and the need to manage those risks appropriately. In the district plan at the present time, we have a number of layers, including flood management areas where higher floor levels are required. We also define high flood hazard management areas and flood ponding management areas where intensification is not enabled, and we're proposing the latter 2 as qualifying matters. Flood management areas would not preclude intensification, but they would still apply and put limits on earthworks, but also prescribe floor levels. Even beyond the district plan and the qualifying matters I've described, we also have other tools and powers in our toolbox, and that includes the Building Act to set minimum building platform levels, bylaws. As I touched on, we do have powers under the bylaw to decline any connection, and we'll use those powers as we have done in the past to ensure there aren't effects of intensification beyond what is acceptable. Next slide, please. The plan change on intensification that I've just outlined is one of 2 plan changes. The other is on heritage, and the heritage plan change is proposed to be taken to council alongside plan change 14 for notification. We did in September have approval to notify the heritage plan change, but there has been changes to it, and it is proposed that it goes out alongside the intensification plan change given the relationship between them. Unlike the intensification plan change, though, it will follow a standard plan change process. Next slide, please. Now, this slide just seeks to summarise Council's role. We have received questions around this, and Council is ultimately responsible for making a decision to notify the plan change. It's not subject to the approval of the investigator or the minister. The council is ultimately the one that has to approve it. If council were not to approve it, then there is a method by which the minister can intervene under Section 25 by appointing a person to notify the proposal. We have had the investigator in place, but as John Hardy has spoken about previously, it's not his role to give approval of the plan change. Next slide, please. So looking ahead, subject to council's approval on the 1st of March, we will notify the plan change on the 17th of March, which is a couple of weeks after that council meeting, recognising the planning and need to notify all affected persons. The submission period will be 30 working days, allowing more time than the statutory timeframe of 20 working days. Furthermore, we're proposing assistance to submitters. So the Ministry of the Environment is funding a service. Jane West is going to provide advice to submitters on how to go about preparing a submission, but she won't be able to comment on the merits nor write the submission herself. However, council staff are having discussions with Community Laws Canterbury of them providing additional assistance to submitters. Several key points to make before I finish. The notification of the plan change is the start of the process, start of the statutory process, and allows people to make a submission and to express their views on it. It's important that anyone that does want to have their views heard makes a submission. Unless it's in writing using the submission form, it cannot be accepted. So verbal feedback we cannot consider for the statutory process. I'd add that the independent hearings panel has, as appointed by council, will provide an inclusive forum for the public to be heard and to participate. Next slide, please. So in terms of timeline, I've mentioned the 1st of March council meeting when council will be asked to approve the plan change. Thereafter, the 17th of March, the plan change will be notified, and then following that, the investigator is anticipated to submit his final report to the Associate Minister. June, July, we'll summarise the decisions that have been sought by submissions and then invite further submissions for a period of 10 working days. And thereafter, submitters and the council will prepare reports and present evidence to the independent hearings panel, who are expected to convene for at least 2 months to hear submissions. Thereafter, the panel will make a recommendation to council, and it's anticipated the council will make a decision by April 2024. And that's the end of my presentation and Dave's, and we welcome any questions.
Thanks, Mark and Dave, for your comprehensive presentation. Just a quick apology to anyone who experienced issues viewing the slides at the beginning of the session. Slides will be available on our website early next week, as promised. Further details of the proposed plan changes and the qualifying matters that have been discussed here this evening will be available as part of the council meeting agenda. That's the council meeting where they will decide whether to notify the plan changes. A map with property level detail will be available on the 17th of March if they do choose to notify. And at that stage, every household and property owner in Christchurch will receive information in their postbox about how to find out about the plan changes and how to make a submission. So rest assured, we're going to try and make sure everybody finds out about these plan changes. I'm now going to start firing through some of those questions that you've sent through and try and get as many as possible answered in the time that we have available. Go into our sheet, bear with me. So the existence of the Takaro Avon River corridor has been identified as a qualifying matter under PC 14. This would mean that the ex-red zone could not be developed, leaving the area as a wellbeing resource for the city. It seems grossly inappropriate that this land could be given or sold to developers to make a private profit, eroding the OARC area. Is council pursuing this? If not, why not? Mark, I think.
Yeah, so I explained during the presentation the qualifying matter proposed that precludes a large part of the Atakara Avon River corridor from intensification. In terms of the land being sold or given to developers, Lynn's on behalf of the Crown sold the property to a private individual, and further details can be provided on that at a next as part of publishing the answers to the questions next week.
Great, thanks, Mark. For properties that have private stormwater drains, has council included this as a qualifying matter? Because as we understand it, council takes no responsibility for maintenance of these drains and may not even have the drains on their plans. The question goes on a little bit further, but I think the answer there is quite succinct, Mark.
Yeah, so private drains, they would be and their capacity would be considered for the Building Act process. So anyone wishing to develop would need to demonstrate how they would manage stormwater, and it's certainly a matter that would be considered for the consenting process.
Lovely, thank you. Have you sought professional input into the implications of this magnitude of intensification on Christchurch's infrastructure? So another infrastructure question, in particular the impact of buildings with almost no impermeable land left and multi-use units, each with toilets, dishwasher, washing machines, etc.
As I touched on earlier, infrastructure planning will be continue, and we'll need to consider the degree and distribution of intensification and consider how our plans are adjusted to align with the changes in growth foreseen, and that will consider what upgrades are required and approvals associated with that.
Lovely. Here's a probing question. Based on the most recent information you received from government-appointed investigator John Hardy, what will happen if council votes a second time not to notify PC 14?
So following the council decision, the investigator John Hardy will prepare his report for the Associate Minister with a recommendation, and ultimately that recommendation will reflect the preceding events. Should council not approve the plan change, it's possible the Minister will appoint a person under Section 25 of the Resource Management Act to direct that the plan change is notified. Yeah, thanks.
Cool. So next question. Given the huge increase in impermeable surfaces laid down with intensification, what is being planned to prevent the city becoming a heat island, to improve its sponginess in preparation for weather events, and can plan to address biodiversity loss taking place with the disappearance of gardens around the city?
So I only briefly touched on this, but the council is proposing a requirement for 20% of any site to have tree canopy cover, and if not retained or planted, that a financial contribution is payable, and in requiring that, the tree canopy cover is expected to mitigate some of the heat island effects of development and the loss of biodiversity that's touched on in the question. With regards to sponginess, any development needs to provide a solution to manage stormwater runoff from that site, and which is subject to council approval, and that could include low impact urban design that accommodates stormwater, such as rain gardens. So that's certainly something at the forefront of our minds given the events up north.
Yeah, there's a few nuanced questions there around flooding. I think Mark has answered those, certainly given an overall response, but we'll answer those, I think, any outstanding in the document that we provide to make sure we've got all of that detail squared away. Walkable catchments, another question, but you did cover that in the presentation. With living costs and house prices at an all-time high, climate change and an obesity crisis, what changes are you making to improve the physical environment that we live in?
The intensification of residential and commercial areas is anticipated to support greater accessibility to activities and services by sustainable modes of transport, and In doing so, that can reduce reliance on private vehicle and the costs associated with travel. With intensification enabling delivery of housing to the market, it's also anticipated to contribute to providing increased capacity to meet demand and reducing the upward pressure on house prices. I would add to that the council is also proposing Ōtautahi Christchurch plan, which is setting a vision and outcomes for the city and what we want, and that will be considered by council at a future date, but will support outcomes in the face of intensification.
Great. Got a question. What considerations will be given to public transport, planning roads, traffic flow, and this district plan change? You've covered a bit of that already in the presentation. Did you want to add any more?
There's an underlying assumption in the national policy statement that intensification occurs in and around commercial centres because of their accessibility to public transport. We also will be required, if mass rapid transit is endorsed and funded, we're also required to enable intensification around mass rapid transit stops up to of at least 6 stories, which would be a future date if that's confirmed.
Thank you. So high density of 6 stories has not been mentioned much in the media. Can you cover some of that in the webinar? You have done a little bit, you've talked about it just then. Is there any more to add to that?
Just the high density zones proposed in and around the central city and their largest suburban centres with a height of 6 stories or 20 metres, and that's directly responding to the national direction.
Thank you. So questions that were asked in the chat this evening. Why not let the free market determine, oh, this was good. This is where the chat did its thing and people started talking to each other. Thank you for taking part in that. Why not let the free market determine density levels? I don't particularly care about sunlight as I don't spend much time in my house. I just want more affordable housing. Any comments on that?
The council's responsible under the Resource Management Act for managing the effects of activities and development and ensuring a suitable level of amenity. The national policy statement recognises that amenity will change over time, but there remains a need to manage those effects through a range of rules, including setbacks, height limits, and with intensification, there's a need to ensure the right package that is enabling of that development, but also manages effects such as shading on neighbours' property.
Here's a very overarching question. What is the purpose of restricting development?
Broadly speaking, covered that just with reference to managing the effects of development. Under the Resource Management Act, we've got a role to manage the effects of development, subdivision and land use, and those effects are managed by way of policies and methods in the district plan, which may be seen as restricting development, but for a better outcome.
Yeah, I wonder if the person who asked that question this evening would like to provide a little bit more detail about the specifics there, and we might be able to build on that response a little bit for you. Will the public transport access qualifying matter be reviewed whenever public transport networks are changed by ECAN?
So the core bus routes that we have defined for the purpose of limiting intensification around it's based on future planning and has been established for a business case which defines where the greatest level of investment will be. It's not just in terms of the bus routes themselves, but also the infrastructure. So bus lanes, which have been established on some major roads, as well as bus stops, and with the certainty of those routes, there's investment around those corridors, and so we can act with the level of certainty of where the core bus routes will continue to serve. The naturally, but public transport routes tend to be between major centres, and on that basis we can act. And given the still the extensive area covered for the purpose of intensification, even if there were changes to routes, that would likely be accommodated within the area that is shown for intensification.
Lovely, thanks for that, Mark. There are a few questions around the proposed setback. People wondering if this would encourage speeding within the road corridor that makes the city less walkable or bikeable, impacts on air quality, which is shown obviously to have an impact on people's quality of life. Do you have any comments around that?
So the medium density residential standards prescribed that were to apply is 1.5 metre setback from the road boundary, and that's reduced from the setback that currently applies to suburban areas. The proposal for the setback on the two major corridors, or city spine as I call it, is to facilitate outcomes of buildings being further back in order to support enhanced public transport, but also walking, cycling, by providing greater width in the space for those forms of transport. The council, if it's in order to prescribe a setback that's greater than what is directed, we can only do that by way of a qualifying matter, and we're putting forward that setback on those two main corridors, but have not proposed it on other sites. We don't consider there's rationale for a qualifying matter that would further setback buildings in other locations.
Oh, I think Dave's just going to jump in with some information there too.
Thanks. So just to comment on the road corridors, what we find when we try and fit bus lanes and bike lanes into a 20-metre wide road corridor is that we don't then have space for trees and other amenity as well. And it's very difficult to fit in all the things that would create what we might be considered a complete street. And so in order to have some amenity and the ability to fit in the different transport modes, we do need a wider corridor than 20 metres. So it's about providing all the things that a street should. Otherwise, we find that we have to make a lot of compromises and we get a very kind of basic standard street that's mostly comprised of hard surface.
Lovely, thanks for that. Really important addition. I'm really sorry, everyone, but we've hit 7 o'clock, so I'm going to ask one more question of the team and then we'll wrap up. Trees are very important to everyone. They always are in Christchurch. Financial contributions redistributes trees away from the places that need them. Do we have any comments on that from the team?
So the financial contributions that would be taken in lieu of retaining or planting trees would be that money would be used for land and trees as close as practicable to the sites that they relate to. So the intent is to retain the tree planting in the area that the development is occurring within. Adding beyond that, council has a draft urban forest plan out for consultation, and that signals the large tree planting program, which would be to further support tree canopy cover. But this plan change is focused on a requirement for retention or planting of tree canopy, and the financial contributions that are proposed, the costs of that are in excess of what the cost would be for planting, and so it's very much incentivizing the method of retaining trees or planting trees.
Lovely, thanks for that, both Mark and David, for answering those questions. As I said, unfortunately, we have run out of time now. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us this evening. If you have further questions, please contact our engagement team. Details are on the slide in front of you in a second now. A copy of the presentation along with the Q&A, including the questions we didn't get to tonight, any that you send through to us over the weekend, that will be provided on our website and emailed to you directly early next week. The other thing that we'll send as part of that is a link to provide feedback about the session itself. We've had some lovely feedback to date. Thank you very much for that. But we are always looking to improve our webinar offerings, so please let us know if there is anything that we could do better. Just a reminder in terms of making submissions, if the council do choose to notify, everyone who makes a submission will then be invited to take part in further consultation. If you do not make a submission, you will not be part of that later process. So make sure there's lots of differing views out there in the community, and we're hearing those loud and clearly. So make sure that your voice is heard by the Independent Hearings Panel as well. So ngā mihi nui from myself and the webinar team. Pō marie.